Okay, so I'm Ade Oshineye. I work at Google. I think we've captured that. I wrote a book. Small tip, don't write books. You won't make any money. I spent 4.5 years with a colleague in Chicago basically going around the world interviewing people who are programmers and asking them how they became programmers, and then trying to find commonalities in the experience of these people and then turn those into design patterns you could use to help people get into programming and be effective. 4.5 years, very thin book, available in English, Japanese, Chinese, and a couple of other languages. I don't speak Korean as well. And it's also available with Creative Commons for free, because my co-author and I are both hippies, and we weren't going to make any money anyway. All right, so what I'm going to do today is talk quite briefly about some of the stuff we've been doing at Google+, around the dissemination of information, how you track that, how you measure it, but also how you think about this in terms of what can you do if you have information you want to disseminate and actually make sure it reaches the people it should reach. Now, if you remember Google's mission, it's organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Now, that kind of fits in with the kind of things I've been told this group is all about. So this is the interdisciplinary group, right? Okay, good. Just want to make sure I wasn't at the wrong meeting. All right, so let's begin. When we think about social, we think of it in terms of answers to these 3 questions. Can you give the user a better service if they know who they are, if you know what they care about, and if you know who they care about? Now, there are other definitions of social about how it's about interaction. There are other companies who have very different missions around social, about making the world more open and connected. For us, our mission is about organizing the world's information and making it useful to people. So, if we knew who you are, who you care about, and what you care about, when you typed something into that little search box, we could give you the right answer for you. So if I typed apple, I'm probably not looking for the fruit. I'm probably not looking for Fiona Apple. I'm not looking for the music company the Beatles own. Right now, at this particular point in time, if somebody like me, with my background, and giant Apple fanboy, lots of Apple devices just all over my house, if I were to type the word Apple into Google right now, on this particular day, Google should know that I'm interested in the keynote event that's going on where they're going to be announcing some new stuff, because it has all of this context about me. However, if my mother, who is not into technology and is not into Apple stuff, types Apple right now, Google should know she probably means the fruit, based on the fact that she has none of the other markers that say she's interested in this event. Now, that's a much better search engine. That's a relatively simple disambiguation problem, but with all the extra information, you can actually give the user the right answer. You can do what I mean, as the user would say. Now, when we think about those 3 terms and break them down into slightly more abstract things, identity is one of the problems we have to solve. Who is the user? Not a string, but a name, a face. But also, what's their community, or which communities are they members of? Again, to know that, you need to know, firstly, what people are. My colleague John Pans has this wonderful phrase: people are clusters of heterogeneous identifiers that vary over time. The point being that, from a search engine's point of view, a person is a bunch of URLs. This is your Flickr account, this is your Facebook account, this is your Twitter account, this is your LinkedIn account. All of these URLs are you. But of course, these vary over time because you add new ones, you remove new ones. But we still need to somehow know that this cluster of URLs is still the same person, even if all the original URLs in that cluster are gone. That's a really hard problem. When you think about taking that notion and then apply it to a community, well, what's a community in that perspective? It's a cluster of people that varies over time, where people are, of course, clusters of heterogeneous identifiers that vary over time. So you can build up this. Now you want to say, okay, we have this person, we have their communities. What are their interests? If you've guessed, it's a cluster of things that vary over time. So what we're doing here from a computer science point of view is we're taking these clusters and combining them and saying, this is a person and their interests and their communities. And from that, you can do useful things. The Apple search is an easy one, but it also means we can build things like Google Now. Has anybody here tried Google Now? Okay, so the basic idea of Google Now is the realization that if you have to wait to ask the question, you may get an answer, but it's too late. So the classic example for me, for instance, is I'm at home, I'm waiting for the plumber to come, and I get a notification from Google Now saying you have to leave now if you want to get the train that will get you to Oxford by 6, because it knows how long the train journey is going to take, and it knows that I'm meant to be here because it's in my calendar. Now, if I'm sitting there typing and replying to email and waiting for the plumber to think, I don't remember to search Google and say, hey, what time is the train leaving? So this is a problem Google can solve based on that information that isn't a search problem, because if you wait for the user to search, you won't get it. It also means you can do things where you know what the user means, and you can act upon that rather than what they say. That means you can do spell correction at the most trivial example. But it also means you can say, you typed that word. You don't mean that word. You mean this other word that's completely unrelated, but it's actually what you mean based on your history. That starts to become really powerful. So when we think about social, it's about how it feeds into two things at Google. One thing that Larry likes to call the social spine. He's not a biologist, so the metaphor is a little dodgy. The basic idea is that you can use social as a spine, and then all the other products sort of hang off it. The other idea, of course, is the notion of a social destination. This is the one everybody's familiar with. There is a site you go to, and you're social there. So if you look at Twitter, for example, they have a wonderful new business model based on forcing you to go to twitter.com, or to a specific Twitter app in order to use Twitter. Whereas lots of people, me included, like to use a variety of Twitter clients and different applications. So the social destination approach is you put everybody into one place and they go there to be social. The other approach is you say, well, social is something you weave into everything. And with Google+, we are doing both because that works. So the idea we're doing with Google+ is we're trying to upgrade the Google experience. Upgrade is a wonderful Californian term, which actually means you want to make things better, but you don't want to say that things were bad before. So to do this at Google, you couldn't build yet another new product that was its own social destination. You want something you can weave through everything. So Google+ was conceived as a project. So we're going to unify and upgrade everything at Google. That means all those Google products you've used. For example, who here does not use YouTube?
What was that question, sir?
Who doesn't use YouTube? So YouTube has about 800 million 30-day actives. Firstly, can I just check, does everybody know what a 30-day active is? What that concept means? Okay, the basic idea is that if you're building a service, how can you tell how many people use it? You can't just, you need a number that's reasonably stable, tells you roughly how many people are using this on a regular basis. You can't just count how many people use it on a particular day, because supposing there was some kind of unusual occurrence. So the usual metric is, take a user, if in a 30-day period they visit the site, they're considered active. So in this 30-day period, how many users were active? As in, they went to the site and they did something. And you track that number over time. That tends to give you a reasonably solid metric that works pretty well and is relatively immune to sudden spikes, where something particular happens on one day and a whole bunch of people come there. Now, you can also do 7-day actives, and some people even do 1-day actives. The problem, of course, with 1-day actives is that it's high. You can say, our 1-day active numbers are, and then you pick one particular day when your founder, tried to assassinate the president or something. So with a 30-day active, it tends to be much more regular in terms of showing you usage, and it tends to also reflect seasonal fluctuations because it's month to month to month. So for example, one of the things you'll see in any 30-day active numbers for pretty much any site is summer, which people go outside. They use these services less. One of the interesting things I'm really curious about is how is the growth of mobile going to change that? Because we've got this beautiful cycle where people in the summer use these services less because they're outside. But if they're outside with their phones, that changes it. How does it change it? We're not sure yet. Because you've got such large numbers, you're waiting to see the impact of this thing. It means you can see things like, in these numbers, you can see wonderful fluctuations that indicate whole cohorts of people waking up, reaching for their phone, doing something with it, going to work, staying pretty much off certain services because they're at work. Then at lunchtime, checking their email, and then back to work. Then in the evenings, checking the email. And then last thing at night, maybe checking a news site. So we've been talking about unifying and upgrading, and we've been talking about the notion that upgrade means improve. I don't know if you've all seen the new YouTube homepage. So one of the interesting issues with YouTube is that it's very much like a newspaper. If you think about newspapers, and especially online, they bundle up a whole bunch of content, and then they put it out there. And they expect people to start at the front and work through them all, because that's how you read a newspaper in real life. Except that people don't do that. They get to the articles, the specific articles, because somebody sends them a link, or because they search and they discover that article they care about. So they bypass the front page. They effectively come in through the side door. So for most newspapers, the majority of traffic is not going to the front page, it's going to specific articles every day. Now, if you think about YouTube, you have a similar problem. So, okay, does everybody here know Gangnam Style? Anybody not know Gangnam Style? Wow. Do we have internet access? We can watch it afterwards. But so this video, wow, you know, I feel like I should take a photo of you. Sorry, because you know, the lost tribe who have not seen Gangnam Style. Basically, Gangnam Style is a K-pop video. So it's Korean, it's in Korean, and it's a Korean music video, and it's awesome. It's a parody of over-the-top Korean music videos, which is designed to be even more over-the-top than any Korean music video has ever been. The lyrics are actually quite subversive, but it's in Korean, so everybody else just thinks it's a lot of fun. And it's actually taking advantage of a phenomenon called the Korean Wave, which is the growth of Korea as a cultural artifact in terms of music videos from Korea are actually starting to become popular outside of Korea, in places like Japan, in places like China. And with Gangnam Style, for the first time, it's broken out into the Western world. So it's now, I think, 262 million views. It's up in, I think, the top 20 most watched videos in the history of YouTube. And this video came out in spring this year. The guy who made it has gone from being, you know, quite famous in Korea to being globally famous. He gets invited to American TV shows to teach people like Britney Spears how to do his signature dance. He's had meetings with Eric Schmidt. He's basically everywhere. When we elect him president of the world, you will be the only people who don't know who he is. But the point about Gangnam Style is that how did you find it? Well, it's not on the front page of YouTube. So people have to send you links. And what happens is you have this conversation. Have you seen Gangnam Style? And you say, what's that? You haven't seen that? Oh my God, here's a link. And people send you the link via email or they tweet it to you. Or you're watching an American football game and the band does a cover of Gangnam Style. And everybody else in the crowd erupts, except you. And you don't know what it is, so you do a search and you find it and you watch it. But you notice you don't hit the homepage of YouTube. So we did this redesign of YouTube based around identity. I did that. You log in and you can see which videos your friends have been publicly sharing. Which means if you had YouTube friends, when you landed on YouTube homepage, it would tell you, here are these things that are happening, so that you wouldn't have to be the only people who didn't know Gangnam Style, which I really recommend watching. Oh, I would also recommend watching the jazz cover, which is mind-blowingly awesome. It's Chinese, but it's a Chinese cover of a Korean song, but done in the jazz style. Okay, one of the interesting things about Google Plus from our perspective is that historically there have been a set of problems online in terms of the way people use online services, but also in terms of the kinds of things people want to do and either can't do or can't do easily. So the four big ones: identity, sharing, community discovery, and authority. So I'm just going to take you through those. The first problem for pretty much any service is, who is this user? So you can basically give them a username and password, they can create an account, log in, that's fine. But then you have a little profile description section. What do people say? Oh, well, I'm into the works of Marx and long walks on the beach. But as Judith Butler, the Canadian philosopher, puts it, identity is performed, not expressed. You don't get to say who you are, because when you do that, you tend to lie. Or you tend to exaggerate it a little. You tend to play up the one occasion you went to the opera and downplay the fact that you mostly watch, cat videos and dog skating on YouTube. Whereas if you actually have, say, a stream where people can actually look at that and say, oh, this is who you are. This is what you're really into, and these are the things you've shared publicly. So that makes your identity more of a performance. It's something you choose to say about yourself. Now, the interesting thing is you can craft that identity. You can choose to only share the silly videos privately, and in public, I'm going to share the highbrow things. But people tend not to do that. It's too much work. But you can still do it. So that's the notion of targeted sharing. So this is one of the concepts we have in Google+, and it's increasingly adopted. Facebook has adopted something quite similar. Sina Weibo, the biggest social network in China, recently announced their revamp, which looks very, very similar. They have the model behind targeted sharing is that I can say, these are the people I play football with. These are the people I did politics with. These are the people who are into postmodern, post-structuralist philosophy. And I can choose to share different things to these people. Partly because I want to preserve my privacy. I don't want my football friends knowing I'm into postmodernity. But at the same time, it's just because it wouldn't be a relevant conversation. Just like if there's a set of people here who are really into Doctor Who and we want to have that conversation, I don't really want somebody coming in and saying, it's a bit odd, isn't it, that female characters in Doctor Who never really speak to each other. They always speak to the Doctor or about the Doctor. I don't want that conversation. I want to just have people talking about how cool it is and isn't Science Screwdriver cool. But being able to choose these conversations is really powerful. It also has this interesting side effect. If you can go somewhere and have a relevant targeted conversation about something, you're much more likely to have that conversation. So, for example, if you were coming out of the closet, for instance, and you had a circle of people who knew, you could have that conversation, and you would have that on the web because you knew it was restricted. It changes the kinds of things you can talk about if you know who's in the room. If you don't, well, you have a problem. Speaking of which, we have this metaphor of the room. That is, when you make a post, you choose the audience. But also you choose a couple of other things. So I make a post. Great. Who can see that? Oh, well, it's public. Okay, that's the world, so I'm a lot more cautious about what I say. But what if I restrict it to just 5 people? Now, I've basically said, okay, here are the boundaries of the room. But is the door open? Can those 5 people bring in other people? Can they reshare my post? So if I were to say, hey guys, I'm the new CEO of Apple. I've just been offered a job. But please keep it secret until it's announced next week. And I tell 5 people. And I lock the post. Well, they can't reshare it. At worst, they could take a screenshot and send it out, but that might be fake. If I don't block it, they can say, they can mention a few journalists, and now it's become very public. Or they can reshare it to a wider audience. So knowing that you control the dimensions of the room and whether the door is locked or not changes the kinds of conversations you can have. So in Google+, when you make a post, you choose the circles you can see it, but you can also choose, can they bring in additional people? Can they reshare the post? Because I'm sure you've all seen those stories where something funny, hilarious happens, somebody tells their boyfriend something, who forwards it to a couple of his friends, who forwards it to a couple of their friends, and then, congratulations, you are now famous. I'm sure there's quite a few not safe for work stories you all remember where this has happened. The other thing to think about is community. So, does anybody here know about social objects? Okay. Is anybody here from a sort of sociology, psychology background? Okay, let's try a different thing. How would people say that? What are their people's backgrounds? Just shout them out. Okay. So there's an idea called actor network theory, but that's a little more complicated. We won't talk about that. We'll just sort of skate over it a little. But one of the leading philosophers in that field is a guy called Engstrom, and his son used to work at Google, Yuri Engstrom. He was co-founder of a startup called Jaiku. And he came up with this notion of social objects, the idea that you don't just have an interaction with people. You have an interaction with people around objects. You sort of go up to somebody and you say, oh, I have that scarf. And they say, oh, really? Because I bought it at this shop. And you say, oh, yeah, I know the owner. And suddenly you're having that conversation mediated by the object that you have in common. Or I shoot a Leica, and I wander around and I see other people and they say, hey, is that the M9? I say, yeah. And they say, is that the Voigtline M9? I'm like, yeah. Where did you get that? It's not available anymore. Oh, it's secondhand. I know this guy. And suddenly you're having a conversation with a complete stranger. But it's okay, because you have the camera in common. So social objects are these things that create conversations, and then those conversations lead to the beginnings of communities. You bump into somebody, you have the same camera, you discover you have similar friends, you say, hey, we should all meet up. And then suddenly you've got a bunch of people who are meeting up regularly, who have nothing in common except that initial social object. And you see this again and again in different fields. So the idea that Yuri talks about is this idea that with these objects, you can connect to people without having to have an existing relationship, and then you can start to build communities around them. And he says that when you look at sites like Flickr, you should be asking yourself, what's the social object through which people connect? On Flickr, it's of course the photo. Somebody posts, great photo, you say, thanks. And they say, oh, what did you do? And you have a conversation. Then 6 months later, you meet up. And then 6 months later, you get married and you post a photo on Flickr. Then 6 months later, you post a photo of the baby. And you see this happen on Flickr again and again. It's interesting to see these things happen because why are these people connecting? Well, there's an object that enabled them to have a safe initial conversation. So the reason I have this photo is because, well, that's my hat. It's a vintage hat. And when I posted it, it turns out there are other people on Google Plus who are into collecting vintage hats. But there's also a whole bunch of people who hate the whole keep count and carry on meme. And they all came out of the woodwork as well. There's even a Flickr group devoted to variations on this. Now, who doesn't know Clay Shirky? Okay, that's good. So Clay is a lot of things, but he's an academic at New York University. I love his work, huge fan. Although somebody should tell him his website was hacked about a year ago, but it's only visible to Googlebot, so it sort of spams the internet, but he can't see it because it cloaks from other IP addresses. But anyway, that's in case he watches this. Clay, fix it, please. Trust us. It's remarkably hard to get somebody to fix something when they can't see it. And you say, trust us, it's only visible to us. But he has this notion that we overestimate access to information, whereas we underestimate access to people. Now, this is ironic because at Google, we're all about organizing the world's information, getting you access to the information you want, the information you need, rather than the people you need or want. Now, this is interesting if you think about communities as a mechanism to get access to information, or as a mechanism to get access to people. So when we think about the tools within Google Plus and how they can give you this community, where community is a mechanism to get access to people or to get access to information. So we have hashtags. Does everybody know what hashtags are? Excellent. So hashtags work pretty well as a way to find other people having conversations about the same topics you're having. And if you see the same people popping up again and again and again on this particular search result for that hashtag, you get the feeling this person has similar interests to you. And so it might be an idea to follow them. And you see here, the hashtag is acting as the social object, the legitimate reason for you to have a conversation. It's very, very weird if you go up to a complete stranger and you say, hi, I'm Ade. You are? Ken, nice to meet you. It's weird. But if it's like, hey, I have the same shoes, you may have a conversation that's slightly less weird. I don't have the same shoes, by the way. But I'm sure we can find some object in common. So we also have a thing called ripples, which I'll talk about later, which is for actually visualizing the spread of information through social networks. Now, one other thing, do you guys know about Hangouts? Anybody not know about Hangouts? Okay, the simple explanation is that when we were building Google+, we sort of said it's a bit weird that when we think about social, we think about somebody in a big room full of people, ignoring them all and fiddling with their phone. And it seems a bit weird. Shouldn't social be about face-to-face interaction? And shouldn't our technology help us connect with other people rather than disconnect us from other people? Arguably, my argument would be actually you're connecting with other people than the people in this room. But we built Hangouts as a simple video chat technique. I mean, we've had Hangouts in Google Talk for ages, since at least 2007, I think. But it was one-to-one. It was a simple communication technology. And we were at the stage where people were thinking, what will you do with phones? Well, I could imagine you could use it to broadcast, music performances. I'll dial into the opera and listen. But once you start thinking about, well, what if I could bring other people in? What if I can bring 10 people into that chat who don't all have to be in the same place? Well, that's different. What does that do? Well, we're not sure. Let's find out. So we built it. And we use it for all our meetings now. Because it turns out it's really, really convenient to be able to just have a video chat for free. And then somebody came along and said, we have this YouTube live streaming thing, which, by the way, right now is live streaming the premiere of James Bond's Skyfall, which looks like it's going to be awesome. The problem with live streaming is I want to interact. I want to shout at them and say, "Oi, James, over here." You want to say something like that and have them respond, but you can't do that. So we looked at Hangouts, 10 people interacting with each other. We looked at YouTube live streaming and went, what if you brought them together? So now you can have 10 people interacting, but other people, as those people leave, other people can join in, and you can have a much bigger discussion, much bigger conversation. You can bring in anybody and have them meet anybody. So for example, we ran a Hangout on air with Barack Obama recently, where he basically went into the video chat and random members of the American public, who'd been carefully vetted, basically were able to ask him questions. My favorite moment is when this woman who's dialed into the Hangout from home brings her kids in and says, "Come and meet the president." And the kids are just, because they really don't have anything in their mindset for, what do I say to the president if we're just chatting? And actually one woman is smart enough to realize that she could use this as a recruitment opportunity and basically asked him if he could get a job for her husband and got a promise on air that he would. So one of the things you can do is use Hangouts and Hangouts on air to basically connect to people because you can see their faces. But then other people realize that if I run this regular free live stream with interaction, it's basically a TV show. I can run my own chat show. I can create a community around a topic or be a brand and actually do this regularly. And suddenly, I've got a couple of million people who watch my show about taking photos in San Francisco. And now I'm a star and I have a fan club. Or I'm at the heart of a community. The other thing we have is the notion of circle sharing. This is basically, okay, who here doesn't use Twitter? Okay, so I was going to use Twitter as a model to explain this, so we'll find a different model. Think of it this way. You turn up on a new social site and you say, so I'm really into shooting old black and white, cameras from Eastern Europe. Who else is into that? And you just get silence, because that's a pretty obscure thing. Now, supposing you do that and one of your friends is into that, somebody you actually know, and they say, hey, not only am I into that, but I know 45 other people who are into that. You should follow them. What they can do is say, here's the list of those people I put together, and give it to you. And you can choose to follow all 45 in one go. And so what this means is if, say, somebody very famous were to say, here's a list of doctors who are into evidence-based medicine, you should really follow those guys and share that. Those doctors suddenly get a massive audience overnight. The other thing is the circle they've shared, that can be reshared and passed along and modified, of course. So what this means is somebody can become very, very popular. They can grow a massive audience very, very quickly. But it also means that sets of people can grow the same audience. So if you're thinking about this in terms of creating communities, it's very powerful. We have a few other things. We have trending terms, which is basically what are people talking about? Again, it's sort of solving the problem of here are my narrow interests. And occasionally I surface out and I say, what's the world interested in? And I find out that the Iron Man 3 trailer came out today. Or I find out that there's a James Bond thing going on tonight, or there's the Apple thing going on tonight. And I say, oh, that's what's big. And I may also find out that some celebrity is being caught drunk somewhere, because that's what the world is interested in. We also have this notion of what's hot. So what's hot is it's something new, something nobody else has done so far. And it's a little different. Basically, you want to find out, here are the trending terms. Oh, people are talking about the new Iron Man 3 trailer. That's okay, but where are they talking about it? Which is the post that has the active conversation? What's basically hot? So what you want to do is to say, well, here's something that's hot, where hot it doesn't just mean it's popular, because otherwise it becomes, somebody massively popular, massively famous just posted about their dog and they got hundreds of comments. That doesn't mean it's hot. What you want to do is to find something maybe a little more obscure. Somebody who's only got 20 followers just posted this thing and it's got 50 plus ones in an hour. Oh, that's quick. And if it's accelerating, you want to sort of point people to that. But of course, that becomes self-perpetuating. And so one of the interesting side effects of what's hot is somebody obscure can post something that catches a few people's eye in the beginning, and that boulder just sort of rolls down the hill, gathers more and more mass, and suddenly they've got a massive audience in their stuff. So it's happened to me 3 times. It tends to be very mainstream stuff. So I posted a video of a drone flying through Bangkok and recording it. It's awesome. It's set to dubstep as well. So it basically hit lots of people's interest. What's Hot basically is a way to connect the whole community to a very small set of content, which means you can put together a critical mass around something. But it also means a whole bunch of people who don't necessarily look for your content, who aren't necessarily interested in your content, but who've chosen to opt in to What's Hot, saying, please Google, put stuff in my stream that is really, really interesting, that's going on, that's important to the world. Put that in there so I can see the conversation. Downside is, you'll see what everybody in the world cares about. Now, one of the things we can do with this is you can say, okay, you can put an audience together around something obscure. But you can also help people discover stuff that they would never have discovered. So for example, Gangnam Style. You would never have discovered that. So you're just not going to go searching for what's cool or what's really new in K-pop. But if that turns up in What's Hot and it's got 1,000 plus ones, and you recognize some of the people who plus one it, you think, oh, I should really watch this. So that the next time somebody says, hey, what's Gangnam Style? You can say, oh, I know that. The other thing, of course, we have is the suggested users list. So if you've seen things like Twitter, it's basically has a set of people who are active and interesting and have a community around them around a particular topic. So here's a bunch of photographers, here's a bunch of newspapers, here's a bunch of charities. Again, what you're doing is giving people a set of things that basically point them at a nascent community. Because you start up on a new social site, you have no followers, you don't follow anybody, you need a little guidance. By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So the other thing in terms of looking at problems is authority. So who here has published papers? Okay, could somebody tell me the name of one of these papers?
Avoidable waste in research, medical research.
So why should, if somebody's looking at the paper, how are they going to decide if they should read it or not?
The title might be helpful.
Okay.
And the open quote, which is in fact someone's personal experience, might lead them into it.
Will they be influenced by knowing who wrote it?
Don't know.
Supposing that paper were published and it said as the author, Britney Spears, would people be more or less likely to read it than if it had your name on it?
Less.
There's the authority.
So one of the interesting things, and this is actually one of the insights behind PageRank, is the realization that knowing who wrote an article changes your likelihood of clicking through. Now, if that means if we showed you the author of a particular web page in search results, it affects your click-through rate. It also means, of course, we can actually solve one of the more interesting problems. All right, so I'm going to try a little quiz. I'm going to ask a question. I want people to just shout out the answers. Okay? Who wrote The Art of War? Anybody disagree? Nobody? You all think it's Sun Tzu? Actually, Niccolo Machiavelli wrote a book called The Art of War. Sun Tzu also wrote a book called The Art of War. Machiavelli's version, by the way, is longer and more boring. It's so boring. But if you ever want to run an army, Machiavelli's version is perfect for that. Every little detail. Where should I put the toilets? What should I name the streets? When am I in the army camps? Should they face north, east, south, west? How should I manage the fact that my army consists mostly of people who can't read? It's really, really detailed. Obsessively detailed. But when you type Art of War into Google, Google doesn't know which one you mean because up until quite recently, we didn't have the notion of an author. So when you ask the question like, who wrote The Art of War, you need the notion of authority of this person wrote it. If Britney Spears writes a book called The Art of War, it's probably not going to be a really good analysis of military strategy, because we know Britney Spears, we know her interests. So what we're trying to do with authority is saying we have the person's identity, we know their interests, we have their community. We can use that to work out the kinds of things they write, which other people agree is important. Of course, the weight of those other people's importance is based on their authority units, recursive. Again, very much like PageRank. So if you think of it in terms of citations, if you have a paper that's heavily cited, that paper is authoritative. If you have a researcher who's heavily cited, that researcher is authoritative on that topic. So we're taking those ideas and applying that to the web, to search. But we can also look at things like how content spreads. So you make a post. Anybody can make a post. You decide who you want to share it with. Is it a public one because you want to reach the maximum number of people? Is it private to a specific circle or set of circles because you want to have a very focused conversation? Now that you've done this, you've got to be thinking about how is this going to spread. So typically what happens, so for example, this morning, I posted a link to Marvel Philippines version of the Iron Man 3 trailer. That was actually a mistake, but I decided it was actually brilliant on my part because it's a pretty obscure version of the video when the UK version, the US version, all the other versions are available. I clicked on the wrong link. But as I can watch the spread of that, I can see my influence because this particular weird version of this video is spreading. It's actually the same video with different URLs. Marvel had an interesting structural problem. Now, what you're seeing is, as this reshare goes out, my original statement about the video carries with it. So these people who don't know me, but who are seeing this because somebody they follow reshared it, get my little message. And they may click through to me and say, what else does this person do? And look at my stream and see the rest of my identity performed. So, as you see more and more reshares, one of the things I should point out is that one of the things that makes Plus and Twitter really different is the resharing mechanism. This is the thing people tend to miss out. It's not how many people interact with your post. It's about how many reshares you get and how many interactions those reshares get. Because that defines the total audience of your content. So if you're thinking about spreading some information that's health related, it's not enough to post it somewhere authoritative that gets lots of publicity. You want to get people to engage with and to share it to their friends because people are much more likely to actually read it then. There's a surprisingly low number of people following the Foreign and Commonwealth Office's Google Plus page. However, when they post cool things and I reshare it, quite a few people read that because it's from me and they're following me because I post interesting things. It might be the next Gangnam Style video, or it might be a video about how they've changed the forms they use in the embassy. Now, one of the interesting things in this world is you have these posts. How do people find them again? So you make a post and a year passes. How do you find it again? Well, you go to google.com and you type in something relevant and it shows up. One of the things we're doing with Google Plus is we show, when you search on google.com, we have something called Search Plus Your World, and it shows public content from Plus. But if it's private, but you were given access to it by the person who wrote it, we show it to you on google.com as well. So what this means is if I write something incredibly insightful about Paul Ryan, but I wrote it 2 years ago, well, actually, let's say a year ago, I shared it on Plus to just, a bunch of people I knew from various things. And today, you happen to be searching for Paul Ryan, that post might turn up. Now, at the time, it wasn't relevant, but now it is because perhaps you're trying to decide who to vote for. So one of the things search does, especially search that's thorough, that actually has all the content. So if you use sites like Twitter, for instance, one of the things you'll realize is they only show you the last 14 days. If you're trying to do research, that's a problem. If you are trying to dig up old content, because old content may have suddenly become very relevant, that's a problem. One of my favorite stories about this is, does everybody here know who Monica Lewinsky is? Okay, so there are basically no photos of Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky together. None. And when the scandal broke, all the newspapers, all the photo labs, they all basically went crazy trying to find something, anything, when they were even in the same room. Nothing. And this one photographer said, wait, I think I remember taking one, but it was a terrible photo. And then he basically goes off and he digs through his archives for hours, and then eventually he digs up this one photo. And he's made more money from that one photo than all the other photos he's ever taken put together, because there was this one thing. Now imagine you'd posted that to a social network, and he couldn't find it anymore because it was too old. So one of the things we're trying to do with Plus is to say, once you make this post, it should always be retrievable because it's valuable.
So, Simon, do you have an explanation why Twitter doesn't?
It's hard. I mean, you think about how much data is involved. It's a ridiculously hard problem. We have thousands of people who work on search. We've been working on search for 15 years. We still, really scratch the surface of it. It's not something you can turn up and just whip out a solution in a year. It takes a long time, a lot of effort, and a lot of money. And they haven't made the investment yet. It doesn't seem to be a priority for them. But for us, given that we're Google, search is a priority. So for us, it's whenever you put anything in, if you have access to it, or if you're supposed to have access to it, you should always be able to retrieve it. So I can find every conversation between Matt and me. They're all right there, and I can find each of them. Even if I can't quite remember the words, I can type his name, or I can use other things to restrict and eventually find the thing I want. So that changes the way information spreads, because you can have a conversation that starts, and then a year will pass, and somebody else who's interested in that particular topic finds that conversation, and they comment. And when they comment, they reactivate the community that was around that post, the people who are in that conversation, and it comes right back up again. And another year may pass, and then somebody else may find it, and it comes back up again. Obviously, if it's a public post, this is much, much more likely. We've even done some interesting things where with Google News, if you have a post that's relevant and high quality, we will show it next to the articles, because we want to show this is what people are saying about this news article. And that means a public post can get a very large audience, especially if you amortize that over time. So if you have a post and it's public and it's particularly insightful, you can have a thread that lasts for 10 years. Obviously nobody has yet, because we only launched about a year and a half ago. On YouTube, for example, you can see posts that have hundreds of thousands of comments. The quality, it's YouTube, but the quality on Plus is significantly better than that, and we're hoping to raise everything. The other thing hashtags do as well is, this is your post. People can find it by all the things you said in it, but if you also use hashtags, so for example, we have the community on Google Plus has a hashtag called Cataday, which is pictures of cats posted on Saturday. Now, it means you can write a post, and 2 years later, somebody who's searching for Cataday can find your thing. And that person has no idea who you are, has no reason to know you whatsoever, but they found you through the keyword you used. So hashtags basically connect you to new people. So effectively, they are acting as social objects, especially when you combine them with really good search. So if you think about this as your content is spreading, but also your identity is spreading with it. So we have this notion that with things like What's Hot, you can reach a whole new audience of people who don't necessarily know you. But the other thing you can start to see is people who are influencers will sometimes reshare stuff from other people, partly because it says, I'm clued up, I know about Gangnam Style. So for example, Britney Spears posted, hey, I just discovered this Gangnam Style video, will somebody teach me? And so the people from the Helen show in the US, Helen DeGeneres, brought her on, and they brought Psy, the guy who did Gangnam Style, and brought them on together, and he taught her. She's not very good. He's much better at it. And suddenly you have this moment. And what you can do as a high-profile figure, as an influencer, is you can effectively point the attention you've got at people with less attention. And you surface the kinds of people you want to become more popular. So one of the things I do, for instance, is point to something that's written, disable comments on my reshare, so that everybody who wants to have a conversation about that either has to reshare it themselves or go to the original post. So you can basically aggregate communities together this way. Influencers do this because it tends to help them build communities. It also says, I'm clued in. I know about this stuff. You should follow me. Yes.
So don't you think that by doing this, you just like putting off all the information which is in all other social networks,
So
and just putting like picking up in a biased way? I think.
so the
Information from Google Plus.
the problem.
Because if I publish things on Twitter,
Mm,
then it just goes to Nevada and nobody
Yeah.
reads it anymore
Yes.
after 2 years. But if I did the same thing on Google Plus, everyone can still find it after 10 years, after 15 years.
yes. Unfortunately, you can't just decide to crawl a large social network like Twitter or Facebook without doing a deal with them.
Well,
And-
Google is supposed to index the whole internet, which is
Yes,
even bigger
but-
than Twitter itself.
Yes, but you need to get permission, or they'll block you, is the obvious thing to do. So if you look at, say, Bing, they have access to all the data on Twitter and on Facebook, but they pay for this. We've not... It's been a problem for us. It's there's a lot of issues in there, but generally we used to crawl Twitter. For instance, we had a deal with them, and that went away. We say one thing happened, Twitter say one thing, a different thing happened. We couldn't come to an agreement. Unfortunately, if somebody says this is my site, and there are all these users who use it, but it's my data, there's not much we can do. Some stuff from Twitter does show up in search because it's a public thing. But if you think about how much data is coming out of Twitter, if you tried to crawl it, you'd bring Twitter down.
So you mean that if I want to publish something, it's more useful to publish in Google Plus because it's really picked up by Google?
I would say it's more useful to publish it somewhere that has an open crawling policy that says anybody can crawl this. So that could be your own blog, it could be Tumblr. Basically, anybody whose robots.txt file says anybody can crawl me.
Okay, so last question. Is Google Plus indexed by Bing and other search engines?
They can.
They can, but they're not.
I don't know if they do. I don't use Bing a lot. I probably should, to get to understand it, but I don't. So, the other thing is we talked about popular data and popular people. So obviously, circle sharing is one big way. So if somebody with millions of followers shares a circle, these are people I think are really clever. Large numbers of people say, well, that's a recommendation from Lady Gaga. Accept. Which can be huge. Of course, whether it's the right set of people and the audience you're trying to interact, you don't get a choice there. The other thing, of course, is if somebody famous is doing a hangout on there and they choose to invite you, that's also an opportunity to get massive exposure. If the next time Barack Obama is doing a hangout on there, and I get invited, I'm in there with a copy of my book, my book. So it's interesting what that does, because people who grow an audience can become kingmakers effectively, assuming their audience is influenceable. So, have you guys used Google Plus Ripples? Basically, it's a tool we built that shows you who posted something initially, and then who reshared them, and who reshared that. And it basically shows you these ever larger circles, showing you the impact a particular post has had and how it's spread. Now, when we did this initially, we did it the obvious way. This is the first post. This is the reshare, and the reshare, and the reshare, and the reshare. Problem is, if somebody independently posts a link to that same video or blog post, we didn't show it in the lineage of this thing, which meant you were only seeing a slice of the world. So later on, we changed something called URL ripples, which is you put a URL in, and we show you all the places, all the people who've publicly shared that on Google+. Again, we can only show you on Google+ because we have that indexed. So you now have the spread of this, and you can see who spread it. And one of the things that shows you, of course, is who has influence about a particular topic. So you can see, for example, on this one, Engadget posted a link to the Iron Man 3 trailer. And Rosa Gulian also posted, and she had a lot more influence than Mashable. Mashable is a very popular online magazine, but apparently, according to this, Rosa Gulian caused more people to reshare it than Mashable. So it's not just how many people see it, it's how many people see it and then acted upon it. Because remember, influence doesn't mean anything if you don't get people to actually act. So with ripples, we can show you how things spread, but we can also show you that over time. So there's a timeline attached. So one of the things that's really useful for is showing you what happens at particular points in time. So this one, for example, is from the, 9 hours the video had been out. And it had 1,482 public shares. And that's pretty good. One of the things that this does is that you start thinking, wait a minute, that's just shares. If somebody with a million people following them shares it once, that's a million people who could potentially have seen it. So 1,400 shares may not sound like a lot until you think about that multiplied by the audience of each of those shares. That's huge. Now,
Show where the source from the
yes, you can actually, there's a little timeline, you can go back to the beginning and replay it and see how it spread. One of the things this is really cool for doing is it's showing you something that was popular a year ago, then became boring, then somebody discovered it, then became boring, then somebody rediscovered it. And because you're showing the visualization of this, you can see different communities discovering something. For example, one of my favorite videos is called Spanish Longboard Girls Crew. It's a bunch of girls in Madrid skating on skateboards. Played with really great musical backing. It's awesome. And the thing is, when it gets published, you can see it. It's all Spanish people because it's a Spanish video. And then somebody, who's an Anglophone discovers it, and suddenly it's huge, and it's a community of English-speaking people. You can see the same thing with stuff like Psy. Korean names, and then suddenly it's a whole bunch of English people, or Anglophones anyway. So you can see the spread in time, but you can also see the structure of communities. Who's likely to share this person? Whose reshares have more impact? So if you're trying to to track information spread and try to discover communities, this is an incredibly powerful tool. We also, of course, show you who we think the influencers are. So as you can see on this one, Engadget, because they shared it originally. Rosa Gallian, because she had 46 people reshare her post, which is huge, and I've never heard of her. We also track things like, what's the average length of a chain? Because that's really useful for saying how far this thing spread. We also track things like how many shares per hour, because that's a metric that's useful for telling us how hot the thing is. And we, of course, break this down by language. Because I'd ask, please. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Just to ask if you don't have the other index to Facebook, is there a feature that have some sort of sense of how it is going to be done that? Like you're looking at Ripple and the time part of one. Can you get a sense of transferring elsewhere?
So we can't do that, sadly, because one of the challenges with ripples is you need to know who posted it, which means you need to know the identity associated with the page. So we can do that for Google Plus because if you posted it, you have to have a Google Plus account. It gets harder to do that for the web itself. We can do some stuff for YouTube, for instance, where we can show how it spread, but we can also, because we can look at the referrers, we can see a spike, for example, with like, okay, this was first time this was shared on Facebook, and you see this spike. You can do things like, one of my favorite examples is Bing had a homepage cover, which was about the Docklands Light Railway in London. And when you click through the video, you can look at the stats on YouTube, and you can see how much traffic Bing had driven to that video. So that's because you have the referrer passed in the URL, well, in the header. So we can do that for some parts of the web, but things like Facebook are beyond HTTPS, so you can't do that.
Is the tracking the ripples about a certain topic, or is it about a certain user? So I mean, can you have an impact factor of each?
We only track we only track public reshares of a particular URL. So we don't attach it to topics. We don't track it for people.
But can't you make a ranking of the most influential?
You can. The problem, of course, with that kind of system is that it gets gamed. If you create, this is the one global leaderboard, everybody tries to game it. You see this pretty much everywhere. So whereas what you've got here is effectively a leaderboard for one URL. And there's always another URL coming along, so there's no point trying to game this one. So, in terms of mental models for this, I'm not sure how much of a background people have in things like social network analysis, but let's try. Who knows Mark Granovetta? Excellent. So you know his paper, The Strength of Weak Ties, and some of the work he's done on analyzing Flickr's social graph. So when we think about ties in Google+, we think about them in terms of three things. Strong ties, so people you have strong permanent ties. So for example, your mother, you can't really avoid her. Then you have weak ties, people, the guy you bumped into in the shop in San Francisco who had a Leica. It was a weak tie, especially if you maybe connect and give each other your business cards. You're probably not going to meet each other for Christmas. But you might bump into each other again, like, hey, you, and you have that conversation. And it typically is mediated by a social object. But then you have temporary ties. So for example, my plumber, if he ever turns up, comes to my house, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And for a couple of hours while he's there, we have a strong tie. But then after he's gone, now, when you think about things like that, and this is typically how Granovetter puts it, it's all about ties between people. But what happens if you start thinking about ties between people and topics? Or between people and brands? So for example, when Leica created a Google Plus page, I immediately followed them because, well, I love my Leica. Now, when O'Reilly, who are my publisher, created a Google Plus page, I immediately followed them because, well, they're my publisher and I'm deeply grateful. But other people, maybe not. When Google started one, I'm like, well, I kind of already know all this information because I'm on the mailing list internally. So you can create these ties. It's not just ties between people, it's ties between entities. So we have something we call the knowledge graph. So does everybody know what a graph is in a computer science term? So it's not a chart, it's more a nodes which have edges to other nodes. And you can choose you can choose a bunch of things. Well, one, what is a node? So in a knowledge graph, a node could be a person. It could be a concept. So you could have a node that was Britney Spears. You could have a node that was Keynesianism. You could have a node that was a place. And then you have edges, lines between them. And those lines can have information attached. So for example, I could have a node that's Britney Spears, a node that's me, and an arc that says Britney Spears is following me. And then I may or may not follow her back. Now, one of the interesting things is you can model it this way. You can start to calculate things like how many hops are there between Britney Spears and, I don't know, Stephen Hawking. You can start to track this. And then you say, well, that tells us how close they are. If it's 7 hops away, oh, well, they probably aren't very close. If they both follow each other, then they're probably quite close. If you think about circles as basically drawing edges between people, you can start to look at things like the strength of people's relationships. Because if I follow you, that's 1 arc. But what if I put you in 7 circles, but you only put me in 2 circles? That tells that I see 7 different places where we connect, and you only see 2 places. So you see how I think I have a stronger relationship with you than you think I have with you. So it starts to become very interesting in terms of looking at how people can relate to each other. If you think about those arcs as places I can send information along. The other thing, and the classic model everybody uses, is the influencer model, which is if somebody famous posts about it, millions of people will see it, and then millions of people will do it. My favorites are these rock the vote things. Bono gets up on stage and says, kids, you should vote. And then tens of millions of kids go and vote, right? Who here voted because Bono said he should vote? So one of the interesting things about the influencer model, it says, is if you can get somebody big and famous to post something, it will reach lots of people. True. The second bit is those people will then act upon it. And that's the bit that's a little more dubious. There's a guy called Paul Adams. He used to be a researcher at Google. He's now a researcher at Facebook. Good guy. And he wrote a book called Grouped. It's very short. I strongly recommend it. And he talks about this fact that the influencer model is kind of broken. A lot of the research behind it is a little bit shoddy. Shoddy is too harsh. A lot of the research behind it isn't as strong as people think it is. Basically, he's arguing that just because an influencer shares something or says something doesn't actually cause people to act. Instead, in his model, it's not just, is this person have a big audience? It's, are the audience influenceable on that topic? So Bono gets up and says, I've discovered this cool new Irish band. Oh, well, it's Bono, okay. Bono gets up and says, I think I've discovered a new fundamental particle. Not really, because his audience isn't influenceable by him on those topics. However, if Bono says he's discovered a new fundamental particle again and again and again and again, you're going to take a look. He might have. So in Paul Adams' model, he feels that people are influenced by other people they tend to be strongly connected with, but also people they have frequent interactions with. So you meet Bono once. That's his only chance to influence you. But you meet your brother several times a day, perhaps. well, now he has all these opportunities to influence you, and so your brother is more likely to influence you, or at least the community around him. But also, you know the things your brother's an expert in. So for example, my second eldest brother is an Olympic Taekwondo martial artist. So if he gives me tips about martial arts, I'll pay attention. However, if he gives me tips about, I don't know, photography, probably not. In the same way, if I give him tips about photography, he's likely to pay attention because he knows I'm really into photography. But if I give him tips about fashion, he can filter that through all of our previous interactions and then make his own decision. So Paul Adams' model is a little more nuanced, but it has this advantage that it seems to be more accurate because people connect with other people and they can use that to decide, based on our past history, how much can I trust that recommendation on this topic. Now, one of the bits where I disagree with Paul is that in his model, he feels that the people who are most likely to influence us are strong ties, specifically strong permanent ties. The reason I disagree with that is because in his model, your mother, well, you have a strong permanent tie with her, massive influence. However, a lot of the ties people are making nowadays are to people who are weak. They're weak ties. So you are influenced heavily, for instance, by a particular author, because say you read every book he's ever written. In my case, an author called Robert Jordan. I've been reading his books since roughly 1990. He's on the 14th book. He actually died a few years ago, and somebody else is finishing his series. But I've been reading his books for just under a quarter of a century. So he's had 25 years or so to influence me. We never met, we never will meet. But he's had this massive influence on my life. Now, this is one of the interesting things. If you start thinking about different ways strong ties can influence you on certain topics, and the ways weak ties can influence you on other topics through repetition. So one of the things that this leads to is you say, well, if influence isn't get somebody famous to say it, if it's not just somebody getting up on TV and saying, hi, I'm Troy McClure, and I recommend Deja Blue. If that doesn't actually influence you, unless you're open to influence, or unless it's repeated, well, how do you actually influence people? So we look at something like search. Well, here's the results. Here's 10 blue links. Which one are you going to click on? The one you click on is actually a multi-billion pound business, trying to work out what you're going to click on and why you're going to click on it. So understanding how influence affects this is really, really important to us. It's also really important to advertising. So one of the things we've been doing is looking at what we call social annotations. If you can see people's faces next to search results, so the order stays the same, but we just show you these people endorse this result, these people endorse this other result. Now you can make a choice. So for example, if I look at 10 results for cameras, and I see that my friends who are into really, really expensive cameras all endorse this result, and my friends who are into cheap cameras all endorse this result, I know those people. I can make an evaluation in my head about which one I'm going to click on based on what I'm actually looking for. So the execution of that piece of code is in my head rather than in Google. It's not Google trying to guess what I want. It's Google saying, here's the best results. Here's what people think about them. Now you choose. Now, it's a little hard to do that in search. There's a lot of searches going on. There's a huge amount of content on the web. What you need is something more concrete, something where you can actually see the actions people take as a result of the influence of other people. Something where there's a huge business in the act of, I don't know, reviewing and recommending things, such as places. You think about the restaurant reviews in magazines. What is that? It's an attempt to influence you, that you opt into. You choose to read Faye Mashler in the Evening Standard because you agree with her taste, or there's some other reason. So she reviews a restaurant, she likes it, cool. You're more likely to go there, or perhaps you're less likely to go there. Now, when we brought the same kind of model to Google+, we took the place pages and maps, and we said, well, what if you brought in people? So you saw one of the classic problems you see with online reviews, which is if I run a restaurant, I create 50 accounts, all of which say this restaurant is the best thing since sliced bread. Well, how can you tell? You come in, there's 50 people saying it's awesome. What are you going to do? Decide independently? Maybe. Or I could just say 50 people can't be wrong, and you go there. Now, the problem is if it's 50 people you don't know, can they be trusted? But supposing you look up something and it shows you, as in the case here, oh, well, that's Rito, I've worked with him for years, and that's Alistair, and I've worked with him for years, and they're recommending this place. All right, I believe it. They probably weren't bribed by the restaurant to write a positive review. If you bring in people who, maybe I go to a new restaurant, so I'm in San Francisco, I do a search, these people recommend this shop, I don't know who they are. I click on their profile, I see them saying all sorts of really positive things about themselves. Can I trust that? Well, we know, as I said earlier, identity is performed, not expressed. So obviously I can't trust that. I click on their stream, and I see all the things they posted. If all the things they post are reviews of that same restaurant, saying how awesome it is, I probably can't trust them. But if I see a diversity of things, a variety of things, especially if I see things that resonate with me and my tastes, I'm much more likely to believe these people's opinion on this restaurant. So one of the things we're doing here is saying, well, with local, you have a place where you can choose who influences you. You can choose whose opinions you consume and you then pass on. So what I've been talking about tonight has been about how information spreads, but it always comes down to somebody choosing to believe somebody else and then either acting upon that in choosing to go to that place or acting upon that in they resharing it and effectively passing that influence along. So the main thing I want you to take away from here is that social isn't just about people, saying what they had for lunch. Social is about a mechanism for servicing and verifying a lot of abstract concepts we've always had and turning them into useful tools. That's all I have to. Thank you. So does anybody have any questions?
Is Google Plus embedded in Google Scholar?
No. Although we should.
To what extent are social networks a zero-sum game in sort of a macro perspective? I mean, you talked about, I think Google Plus and Facebook talking about a model. The problem is that types of networks don't run it. It's another type of Facebook. Firstly, I see that changing all the time. I don't know how quickly, but in the meantime, how important is it that the majority are on that?
Well, on the one hand, people have only a finite amount of time in each day. On the other hand, you have to remember that people use multiple search engines. People use multiple phones. I'll give you an example. I have an Android phone and an iPhone. So as a customer, you have accounts on everything. But for us, it comes down to, are we useful? If we're useful, and if you never go post on Google+, but your friends write reviews and those reviews influence your search results, or they influence your behavior once seeing those search results, and you get a more useful version of Google, that's good enough for us. If as a result of your friends, or perhaps not even your friends, people who you follow or who your friends follow, you get better reviews of restaurants, and so you basically search more on Google and you click on more ads because the ads are more relevant, I get paid. That's...
I'm bumping into a lot of people these days that say it's dangerous the amount of information Google has on people, in the sense that to do this sort of thing you need to have a lot of information about individuals, and so the applicants are about that. What would you respond to?
So what I usually do is I recommend you turn on web history and Google Plus history, which is in developer preview. Because what that does is it actually shows you all this information. And then you can choose to delete it or delete parts of it. So our view is, here's a lot of information. Here's the control. And then you decide. Because I think only you can actually decide how much of that information you want Google to know about you. You may decide, for example, that evening you spent looking up those, K-pop videos, you may not want, anybody to ever find out that you, watched the complete set of videos by Girls' Generation. And delete, 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 delete. You control that.
I think.
Oops.
I was just commenting on your question. Did you mean like what Google has saved from their servers, or did you mean just history? Which you
That's also an interesting aspect of it. Yeah, if this is all saved on your servers and there's a security breach or something like that.
So Google spends a lot of money on world-class security people who are much, much better than me. So we actually take security very seriously. One of the interesting things we're working on is that when you see security breaches, it tends to be smaller companies, less technical companies, people who didn't have the time or the money to really invest in security. And so what you see with a lot of the bigger companies is social signing, saying instead of the user using the same password everywhere, which by the way is how you're most likely to get hacked, who here's password is 12345? Don't put your hand up. But the point is, a lot of people use the same password on lots and lots of different sites. And that's actually the biggest vulnerability. Frankly, as far as Google's point of view is, we give people the ability to delete the data they're uncomfortable with. We give you the ability to go to google.com/takeout and basically download all your data, and then wipe your account, and it's deleted. But I think we also have a team whose job it is to try and find better ways to protect that data, better ways to encrypt it, make sure it's really deleted, make sure people can actually find things and say, actually, this one time I did this. No, I don't want that to be recorded. We do things like we build Chrome and has an incognito window, including the mobile version. Because one of the things people forget is your phone is your most personal device. It has so much information about you on it. So, incognito window, search for that job, close it. So there's a lot of stuff like that we're building.
So deleting and removing content is one thing. You said previously, growing up in the multimedia example, that actually if you share something and then you decide to remove it, you can leave it beyond this, which is fine, but data sticks, and data is, people can replicate it and copy it. So, I don't know, if saying it's something, happy photo or whatever, I can save it, and then no matter if he deletes it or if he limits the audience, I still have it. So do you believe that people are actually starting to realize that they have to be cautious?
I think one of the things I sort of mentioned in the talk was this idea that there are limits to what you can do with computer science. Ultimately, all you can do is give people the data, and then the people decide. So if your friends decide to build a blackmail file on you, there's not really much we can do to stop you. We can point out that this is happening. So for example, if you try and reshare something that was shared privately to you, we pop up a little thing and say, the person didn't really want you to do this. Are you sure you want to do this? So you have to make a conscious choice to violate your friend's trust. It gets very, very tricky for us at that point to try and police the trust between people. But if you have any ideas on how to do that better, we'd love to know.
I tend to think that education teaches me research, stops people from not getting into trouble. Before signing up for a social networking site or a similar site where you share sensitive information, I would think that it would be useful to have a large, short notice, bear those things in mind, let's say 3 points, 5 points, instead of hiding everything into, the very lengthy text.
So we have a whole bunch of things we do around that. We've actually started doing a lot of stuff with cute little animated videos. We did a series on the Underground in London, teaching people, for example, how to create secure passwords, because most people don't have secure passwords. Most people's password is 12345 or password with the O replaced with a 0, and actually teaching people to use things like passphrases or to create passwords that are structured like you take the first letter of a phrase like to be or not to be, for instance. That gives you a more secure password. Don't use that phrase, by the way. It's the example. But those kinds of things, they tend to work pretty well, and we're trying. I mean, one of the interesting challenges for us is as your user base gets larger, you have to do more and more fundamental education and actually show people, hey, this is why you shouldn't use passwords like this. And then going out to companies and saying, hey, you guys are running a new newspaper. That's great. But instead of asking people to create a username and a password, where they'll use the same password they use for their bank, and then if you get hacked, the hacker will simply check that account and that password on. What if you use social login so that if you get hacked, they can't do anything with that token?
So my account was hacked, and I managed to get it back. But how would Google or any other cheat player online help me identify who actually did it?
So,
My data was exposed, right? So why?
so that's really
breacher?
So that's really hard. What we tend to do now is we push things like two-factor authentication. So that's the thing. So you should all, by the way, switch that on. Please, God, switch it on. Basically, it's the thing where when you log in, username, password, then it sends you an SMS. And then you type in the code from the SMS into the thing. So that the person who hacks your account not only has to guess your password, they have to steal your phone, which hopefully you would notice.
But still, how do you detect?
So we have a whole bunch of things we do. We've actually did something about a month ago where we notify you about all the other places your account is logged in. And if one of those is different, and we can say, hey, you appear to be logged in from London and China at the same time. So we can do things like that. But often, for example, for me, it'll be, well, actually, that's because I'm actually in China, but I left my machine at home on. And then it becomes, well, okay, sign out all my machines just in case, because somebody might be in my house. So there's things like that we can do, but fundamentally, you can't change people. You can give everybody the tools they need to protect themselves, but that's about it.
Question about the digital footprint. Everyone leaves on Google. So there was a scandal recently in Germany where with the president who had sat down, not the chancellor, the president of Germany, and then his wife had actually she sued Google because whenever somebody was googling her name, the scandal always came up. So she was really annoyed with that. Everyone here might be concerned that whenever something happens or something like violence for women was wrongly and so on, so whenever somebody is bullying binders now, Mitt Romney comes up. So what do you think? Where's the limit of our own responsibility as well as our own control over search results in the first 2 or 3 pages?
Well, think of it this way. If you look up, if your name happens to be Benedict Arnold, and it's you today, and you look up your name in any American, encyclopedia, you'll see a story about a famous traitor. Now, there's a question here about, do you have the right to edit other people's knowledge so that you don't feel uncomfortable? Do you have a right to have facts forgotten? There was a case recently in Germany where somebody who'd been convicted of a murder, and he'd served his time, he wanted Wikipedia to delete the reference to this. The fact that he'd committed this murder, because that was coming up. We had Barbara Streisand, who had a nice private house somewhere, and she basically sued to have it removed from Wikipedia. Unfortunately, that just attracted more attention. So one of the interesting things is, do people have the right to ask other people to forget facts? And because I don't know, because there are lots of things I would like people to forget. I'd like you to forget that I couldn't get the projector working. Okay, the projector worked and it was great. So there's a problem there. Often a lot of these cases where people are saying Google should do this or some technology company should do this, it's actually people avoiding the actual human social problem of saying, should other people act like this? So one of my favorite examples is somebody who I won't name said that, why can't Google just delete all the bad stuff off the internet? And I had to explain to him that Google is like the A to Z company. We basically map the world. If there's a bad place in the world, deleting from the A to Z doesn't change the world. People can still find out about it. People can still share that information with themselves. The right thing to do is to go out and change the world. And then the maps get updated. But it's so much easier to just change the A to Z, because then you feel like you fixed the problem when you haven't. So, for example, the woman, the president's wife.
In that case, it was the other way around. So the problem was already gone and forgotten, but Google still.
So this president's wife, what's her name?
Bettina Wolf.
So Bettina Wolf is the wife of the president who did.
There was a scandal that he borrowed money from somebody to an unfair deal. And the president isn't supposed to do that.
Okay. You notice how we all now know this information? You've now basically blackened her name. Because now we'll all remember that Bettina Wolf was married to somebody who borrowed money he shouldn't have borrowed. But you see, this is my problem. You can pretend the information doesn't exist. I mean, we had the wonderful super injunctions in the UK, for instance, where it was, we're just going to have a court order saying you have to pretend this thing doesn't exist. which meant that when Ryan Giggs was playing football in Manchester at Old Trafford, the crowd were chanting what happened, and the BBC had to basically dub that out of Matches of the Day. You know, it's an interesting world where you basically effectively can legally mandate facts. I think I worry a little about the idea of being able to use the law to state facts, but I don't have any clean solutions.
Well, they do it for privacy, don't you? Like for piracy.
That's more that we don't link to stuff, but it's still there. It's personally, I think this kind of thing where you edit the map, but the world stays the same, and so other people just simply ask their friends, "Hey, where's that thing?" Here it is. You haven't solved anything.
This is much less about the energy usage. I've always wondered, am I burning energy on my machine when I flip-flop around all these things, or is it somewhere in the ether?
You're burning more energy than we are. So the machines and the data centers that we have are very, very low energy. You're probably, now I don't have a PhD, so you probably shouldn't trust my numbers here, but I would say you're probably using more energy on your machine than we are. Because you have to remember, for most of the things we're using, it's very large scale. We've got power plants. They basically tend to be using renewable energy. They tend to be placed out in the middle of nowhere. We spend a lot of time getting energy usage down, because at our scale, small shifts in energy usage are huge amounts of money. So we spend a lot of time making those as efficient as possible. So does everybody else. Because if you spend £1 billion a year on data centers, and somebody comes up with a way to decrease energy usage by 0.something%, that's a lot of money. That person just earned their salary back for the next 10 years. But most people at home, you probably all left the lights on.
And is that sort of order of energy usage? And if you can't make a standard search, but something sort of intermediate, how much energy does that use?
Tiny. You have to remember, most of the time, most of the things you're getting are actually cached anyway. Often, if you're looking for content, it's not even going all the way to Google because your ISP has a cached copy anyway. So people's model of energy usage is horribly broken because they forget that the average house uses vast amounts of energy. I mean, we had some people when I first started Google who came around and did an energy audit of our desktops. And I was like, why is that? Shouldn't the data centers? And we said, well, actually, with the data centers, we've cut it right down so that you're making tiny little things. Whereas here, we just switch off the lights at night, and we save vast amounts of energy. And it's really easy. This is one of the problems that we have. We all live in these massively energy inefficient houses, drive these massively energy efficient cars, take plane trips that take huge amounts of energy. But we worry about data centers, which it's ironic.
Ade, I know there are people who want to ask more questions, but we've got lubrication for that.
Excellent.
Outside, so we just thank you very much and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Oh. Let me just get a photo before everybody.